Hello, my name's Declan O'Dempsey. I'm barrister at Cloisters Chambers. I'm speaking on the 30th of June 2016. This is a talk about how you may be able to get your local authority to do something to stifle the upsurge in racism after the result of the EU referendum. This is a second talk. The first of them dealt with what employers can do about racism. So I'm going to be talking about the tools available for local anti-racism activists. There are principally two that I want to focus on. One is the public sector equality duty under Section 149 of the Equality Act 2010. This is the duty on local authorities to have due regard in the exercise of all their functions to the need to achieve certain equality objectives. These include the objective of promoting good relations between persons of different racial groups. As well as that, another part of the Equality Act deals with whether an act by a public authority, when it's providing a public function, is lawful or unlawful. Does it constitute discrimination or not? To back those two basic building blocks up are, one, the Equality and Human Rights Commission's statutory code on goods, facilities, services, public functions and associations, and also the non-statutory technical guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission on the public sector equality duty. Your role in all this is to gather the facts, get them before the decision makers, i.e. the local councillors, and make them realise the nature of their duty, how it's not just a matter for their officers to monitor and implement. So the first of these tools is the public sector equality duty. Now, I'm about to go through it, but there's no need to have the details of it to hand. Here's what the section says, however. A public authority, so that's a local authority included, must, in the exercise of its functions, have due regard to the need to do the following things: eliminate discrimination, harassment, victimisation and any other conduct that is prohibited by or under the Equality Act 2010. It must also have due regard to the need to advance equality of opportunity between persons who share one racial group characteristic and persons who don't share that racial group characteristic. It's also a duty to have due regard to the need to foster good relations between persons who are of a particular race or ethnic group and persons who are not of that group. Secondly, it applies to people who, although they're not public authorities themselves, are exercising public functions. They have to observe those duties. They've got to have due regard in the same way. Having due regard to the need to advance equality of opportunity involves having due regard, in particular, to the need to remove or minimise disadvantages suffered by persons who share a protected characteristic such as race that are connected to that characteristic. Secondly, to take steps to meet the needs of persons who share a relevant protected characteristic that are different from the needs of those who don't share it. And third, to have due regard in particular to the need to encourage persons who share a relevant protected characteristic to participate in public life or in any other activity in which participation by such persons is disproportionately low. Subsection 4 makes special provision for the needs of disabled persons. So there's a duty to have due regard to the needs of disabled persons that are different from the needs of persons who are not persons with a disability. And this includes in particular steps to take account of the persons with disabilities. Next, the local authority has a duty to have due regard to the need to foster good relations between persons who share a relevant protected characteristic, here race, and those who don't share that protected characteristic, that race. Now, this involves having due regard in particular to the need to tackle prejudice and promote understanding. And it's here that local anti-racism campaigners can insist on the local authority having due regard in its deliberations. The Act then says that compliance with the duties under Section 149 may involve treating some persons more favourably than others, but it does not permit conduct which would otherwise be prohibited under the 2010 legislation. The public sector equality duty doesn't just apply to race, or religion or belief. It applies to age, disability, gender reassignment, pregnancy and maternity, sex and sexual orientation. So I'm not going to deal with the details of the code or the guidance in this talk. You can get a copy of them from the Equality and Human Rights Commission's website, and I'll attach some details on the YouTube box under this video. But I am going to deal with case law, which I'm going to summarise on the public sector equality duty, and I'm going to leave the duties under Section 29, those are the lawful and unlawful acts of a public authority, to another time. I'm going to focus on what you need to do. You need to bring to the attention of the local councillors involved in any decision making on local functions their responsibilities. So this might be in the context of community projects, community safety, or indeed any other aspect which you feel impacts on race relations in your area. Essentially, you're going to be writing a letter and reminding of their duty under the public sector equality duty in the context of racism in the community at the moment. You need to point out the issues you feel give rise to a question of race discrimination, and you can make points like the following to show that you know roughly how the law works in this area. Now, in what follows, I've referred to some case names. You don't need to mention any of those. It's simply, if you want to take your research further, you could look on the internet and find those cases if you want to. So I'm going to run over what the courts have said. It's a duty to have due regard to the need to achieve the aim of fostering good race relations. It's a duty which is non-delegable. Now, this means that the councillor cannot simply be told by the officers of the local council what the requirement of due regard is in relation to any particular decision or function. You should acknowledge in your letter that you realise that the duty is not a duty to achieve a result, but it's a duty to have due regard to the need to achieve the goal of good race relations. However, it's a duty which applies to specific single decisions. It's not something that's related purely to policy development. Then there are a series of points which are derived from the Court of Appeal in the Bracking case. First of all, you should make the point that equality duties, such as the duty to promote or foster good race relations, are an integral and important part of the mechanisms for ensuring the fulfilment of the aims of anti-discrimination legislation. Now, for years and years now, and well before the Equality Act, the courts have acknowledged that race discrimination in particular is a very great social evil. This therefore has nothing to do with any European Union law which has in the same way emphasised the social aim of eradicating race discrimination. UK law was already there before the European Union started to reinforce that message, and indeed a lot of the European Union law on discrimination has been derived from the UK's legislation. But what you should point out to the counsellor is that it's important, so therefore these duties to consider and give due regard and put appropriate weight on the achievement of fostering good race relations can't be treated as a simply procedural step which they have to go through but which is just a box ticking exercise. It's more than that. The counsellor should make a record of the duties that he or she has taken in seeking to meet this duty, to have due regard to the need to foster good relations. Now, this is in the counsellor's own interests, but you should, in your letter, advise the counsellor to keep a note of how they're having due regard to the need to foster good relations in relation to any policy or decision that they're engaged upon. The duty is on the decision maker personally. What matters is what he or she took into account and what she knew. Now, that last point's got implications for what you as an activist need to be providing. If you're aware of information about racism in the local area, which emphasises why there is a need to take particular action over an issue, then you really should include that so that the counsellor cannot say that they weren't aware of the facts. So this duty being a personal duty means the counsellor cannot be taken to know what the local authority officials know or what may have been in their minds when they were offering their advice to the counsellor on how to fulfil this duty. So in other words, it's a personal duty, and in conjunction with the need to provide evidence or the advisability of showing evidence of personal consideration of the factors that are to be considered, it is quite a powerful way of focusing the counsellor's mind. The counsellor, in other words, must actually think about what they're doing and how they're having due regard. It's in their own interest to keep a record. So the counsellor must assess the risk and the extent of any adverse impact and the ways in which that kind of adverse impact can be eliminated before adopting a proposed policy. It's not good enough to fight a kind of rearguard action after a decision has been made. So, for example, you've decided to close down or restrict money for a service in an area, and then information is brought to your attention about how this will impact on race relations, for example, and you then try to deal with that information simply by supporting the decision and trying to deal with the evidence other than by saying, well, let's consider our decision afresh. But what this does mean is that it's important for activists to marshal the facts and put them to the counsellor. So in other words, you'll be saying to the counsellor, if you take the decision that you're looking at in one way, these are likely to be the consequences on the following groups. If you take it in another way, the impact will be lessened. It isn't, of course, mandatory to do this, but your campaign will be very effective if you can get statistics together from relevant sources and local organisations and put those in a letter to the local authority. Now, in the case of the upsurge of racism since the referendum, it may be that there are plenty of newspaper reports in your area which you can bring to the attention of the counsellor, but it is advisable to do that so that the counsellor can assess the risk and extent of any adverse impact of doing nothing rather than taking proactive steps to promote good race relations. It's not good enough for a council to say, we'll try the policy out, see what happens, and if it's got an impact, then we'll mitigate that effect. It's a duty which has got to be taken into account in the formulation of policy and the exercise of other functions. One particular case has provided some further guidance, although it covers most of the points that I've already mentioned. The duty has to be fulfilled before and at the time when a particular policy is being considered, so that before the decision is made, councillors are under a duty to be taking into account its duty to have due regard to the need to promote good race relations, foster good race relations, and it must be exercised in substance and with rigour and with an open mind, and that last point is an important one. If the councillor is simply going through the motions, they will not be exercising the duty to have due regard in substance or rigorously or with an open mind. They'll simply be ticking boxes. Now, it's important to remember that there's no duty for a councillor to make express reference to having paid regard to the duty. And by the same token, making reference to the duty to have due regard is not a kind of talisman against challenge. Actually, what needs to happen is for councillors to show how they have had due regard to the need to foster good race relations. However, if the decision does make express reference not simply to the duty, but to what regard was paid to the duty to foster good race relations, that may well reduce the scope for argument. So in your letter you may want to point this out to the councillor if you feel that by doing so you will A, make them think about it, and B, make them realise that the decision should go in the direction of fostering good race relations, as opposed to favouring some of the other factors that may be involved in the decision making. It is not enough for the councillor to say, well, we've had general regard to issues of equality. This is another way of putting the point about it not being a tick box issue. You've got to have specific regard by way of a conscious approach to the statutory criteria. It's also important to make points to the local authority officers. They've got a duty here as well. Local officials reporting to or advising councillors on matters which are material to this discharge of this duty mustn't simply tell the councillor what the councillor wants to hear. They too have to be rigorous in both inquiring about material factors. As we'll see, there is a duty to make inquiries in appropriate cases, but also in reporting the outcomes of what they have found when they have made inquiries. And the idea is to enable the councillor to have due regard. You should acknowledge that it is not for a judicial review court to determine whether appropriate weight has been given to the duty, but you can equally say that the court will be concerned to see that there's been a rigorous consideration of the duty. If you want to go on to say that the question of whether appropriate weight was given to the duty is something that local residents will be very interested in, that it will be a political point that you can bring to bear. But the courts are very clear about this point, that if it comes down to a question of whether enough weight was given to the duty to have due regard, they're quite reluctant to intervene and to overturn a decision simply because they themselves think that a different weight should have been put on particular factors. Councillors have to show a proper appreciation of the potential impact of the decision that they make on the equality objectives of promoting good race relations, but they must also show that they've got a proper appreciation of the desirability of promoting those aims set out in section 149 of the Equality Act. Due regard means that the court, if it came to a judicial review, would ensure or insist on there having been proper and conscientious focus on the statutory criteria. So councillors must be clear precisely what the equality implications are when they put them in the balance. And activists can help in this way if you have access to information about the implications, for example budgetary ones, of taking a decision one way or a different way. In relation to the need for councils to do something about racial abuse and racial attacks, the equality implications are pretty clear, but it is worth spelling them out to the councillor when you are advocating in one direction for their decision making. As I said, the councillor has to decide what weight to give, but that is in the light of all relevant factors. And as an activist, you can bring to their attention relevant factors which may not be immediately obvious to either them or the officers of the council. Councillors also need to realise, as I mentioned earlier, that the duty involves a duty of inquiry. So it does no good for a councillor to say that something which could easily have been found out by them but wasn't brought to their attention when you have put them on notice that there is an inquiry that could be made. So the duty to have due regard requires public authorities to be properly informed before taking a decision. If the relevant material is not available, they should acquire it. That means that there frequently may need to be further consultation with groups that might be affected. So in general, it's important to make sure as an activist that you've brought the attention of the councillor to an area where you think a question should be answered on the issue of promoting good race relations or promoting equality of opportunity between different races, etc. The public authority will need to have due regard to the need to take steps, therefore, to gather information so that it can properly take steps to take into account the need to promote good race relations. I want to end by talking about what you can do in relation to the surge in racism that we've seen. What I suggest you do is consider writing to your local authority or the local police authority, for example, and asking them about their response to the upsurge of racist abuse, attacks and any graffiti that you've noted in your area. You should ask them what they're doing about it in the light of the increased tension that there has been, and you should ask them about the steps that they believe they could take to do something about it, but point out to them the steps that you believe would be effective in doing something about it. Now, what's the point of all this? Because the remedy of taking the council to the court for a judicial review is not feasible for almost everybody. Maybe a local organisation might be in a position to do it, but what I do say is that you can use the contact you make with your local councillor to raise awareness of the need to take action now to promote good race relations. And you can support the fight back against the minority of people who have been engaging in racist abuse and attacks, who appear to be intent upon undermining the British value of tolerance. And I'll say a word about that now. Some people might question my use of the term British value in relation to tolerance in particular. It's worth considering that there's also the government's prevent strategy. Section 26 of the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act 2015 says an authority must, in the exercise of its functions, have due regard to the need to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. Now that includes any attempt to affect the political process by acts of violence. The government's guidance on the application of that duty, which again is a duty to have due regard, uses a definition of extremism because it links non-violent extremism and extremism to the risk of a person being drawn into terrorism, and it uses this definition. It means vocal or active opposition to fundamental British values, including democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, and mutual respect and tolerance of different faiths and beliefs.